World War III, a term that once belonged to history books, Cold War memes, and doomsday science fiction. But today, millions across the globe are asking the same chilling question. Is World War III coming soon? What started as diplomatic tension and economic rivalry has exploded into open conflict involving the United States, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and other major powers. And at the center of this storm stands one controversial figure, Donald Trump. Could the actions of one president ignite a global conflagration bigger than anything humanity has ever seen? In this video, we unpack the truth, the geopolitics, the mistakes, the fears, and the undeniable facts behind the headlines. This is part one of our in-depth breakdown of how the world is moving from uneasy peace toward a dangerously unstable future. Main story narrative begins. In early January 2026, the world was rocked when United States forces conducted a large-scale military operation inside Venezuela, striking strategic targets and reportedly capturing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in the capital city of Caracas. This action, described by U.S. officials as a counter-narcotics and security operation, sent shockwaves through governments, markets, and international institutions worldwide. Encyclopedia Britannica. For decades, U.S.-Venezuela relations had simmered with tension, rooted in ideological divides, oil politics, and accusations of corruption and authoritarian governance. But this was different. It was the first time in generations that the United States entered another sovereign state's capital and detained its leader under direct military action. The suddenness of the raid, unannounced to Congress and many allies, and sparked immediate debates about legality, presidential war powers, and global stability. Reuters. Experts and world leaders instantly reacted with concern. Some warned that this unprecedented escalation could unravel international norms and embolden other nations to act unilaterally. Others condemned the U.S. for undermining diplomatic channels, arguing that resorting to force risked provoking broader conflicts far beyond the Western Hemisphere. Chatham House. But why Venezuela? At its core, this clash was tied to much more than just drugs or politics. It was intertwined with global power dynamics, energy security, and the shifting balance between major world powers like the United States, Russia, and China. Venezuela holds some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, making it a strategic prize in a world still dependent on fossil fuels even as it navigates climate and economic transitions. The United States increased military presence in the Caribbean, including naval blockades and the interception of oil tankers, further intensified the crisis. Such actions not only disrupted global energy markets but also provoked condemnation from regional neighbors and international bodies concerned about the legality of such moves. The Guardian. Meanwhile, global tensions extended beyond the Americas. In Europe and the Middle East, old conflicts simmered and new fractures appeared. Long-running wars, territorial disputes, and alliances pulled countries into complex webs of interest and influence, a situation eerily reminiscent of the early 20th century landscape that preceded the first two world wars. Is this enough to declare World War III? Not according to most analysts. Even leaders have publicly argued that catastrophic global war is unlikely in the immediate term. Still, they warn that such heavy-handed interventions undermine stability and raise the risk of miscalculations that could spiral out of control, especially when major powers are involved. Trump's strategy, power politics, and global shockwaves. Donald Trump's return to the center of global geopolitics did not happen quietly. From the very beginning of his political career, Trump viewed foreign policy not through the traditional lens of diplomacy, but through power, leverage, and dominance. To him, nations were not partners, they were competitors. Deals were not compromises, they were victories or losses. Venezuela, long labeled by Trump as a criminal narco-state, became a symbol of everything his worldview opposed: socialism, anti-American rhetoric, and strategic alignment with U.S. rivals like Russia, China, and Iran. When the decision was made to act, it was not sudden. It was the result of years of pressure building beneath the surface. Inside Washington, Trump's advisors were deeply divided. Some argued that Venezuela was a ticking time bomb, a collapsed economy, mass migration, and a criminal network that destabilized the entire region. Others warned that direct military action would shatter international law and provoke a dangerous precedent. Trump, however, believed hesitation was weakness. In private meetings, he reportedly framed the operation as a message not just to Caracas, but to the entire world. The United States was done waiting. If diplomacy failed, force would speak. And when force speaks, history listens. The immediate global reaction was electric. Stock markets trembled as oil prices surged overnight. Latin American nations called emergency summits, fearing the return of Cold War-era proxy conflicts in their own backyard. The United Nations Security Council erupted into heated debate, with accusations flying across the chamber. Allies questioned whether they had been consulted. Rivals questioned whether they were next. What disturbed analysts most was not the action itself, but the speed. In an era where wars often begin, slowly through sanctions and proxy clashes, this operation skipped straight to the endgame. Russia's response was calculated but cold. Moscow condemned the intervention as imperialist aggression and quietly began reinforcing its military presence in strategic regions far beyond South America. Naval movements increased. Joint exercises were announced. Diplomatic language hardened. China, meanwhile, took a more cautious approach, calling for restraint while accelerating economic contingency plans. Beijing understood something fundamental. If global norms collapse, every powerful nation gains permission to act unilaterally, and once that door opens, it never fully closes. In the Middle East, tensions quietly intensified. Iran, already locked in shadow conflict with the United States, saw the Venezuela operation as proof that Washington was willing to bypass international systems entirely. Militias aligned with Tehran increased readiness. Cyber operations spiked across multiple regions. Intelligence agencies around the world began reporting a sharp rise in digital warfare and silent attacks on infrastructure, banking systems, and communication networks. World War III, if it ever comes, many experts argue, will not begin with bombs, but with keyboards. Back in the United States, public opinion fractured sharply. Supporters praised Trump's decisiveness, calling it a long overdue stand against authoritarian regimes. Critics warned that the country was being dragged toward a global conflict without congressional approval or public debate. Protests erupted in major cities. Media networks ran nonstop coverage, each framing the crisis through its own ideological lens. Fear, confusion, and nationalism collided, a volatile mix that history has seen before, always with devastating results. What made this moment especially dangerous was not just the players involved, but the timing. The world was already strained, economically fragile, politically polarized, and militarily interconnected. Alliances that once provided stability now risked becoming automatic triggers. A single miscalculation, a misunderstood signal, or an overreaction could cascade across continents. This is how world wars don't announce themselves. They creep forward, disguised as isolated crises. And as the dust settled in Caracas, one truth became unavoidable. The Venezuela operation was no longer about Venezuela. It had become a test of global order itself. Would nations double down on restraint or prepare for confrontation? Would diplomacy recover its footing, or would power replace principle as the rule of international relations? The answers were not yet clear, but the direction felt ominously familiar. Alliances, escalation paths, and how regional wars become global. History shows that world wars rarely begin because one nation wants global destruction. They begin because alliances remove choice. Once countries are bound by military, economic, or ideological commitments, a local conflict stops being local. Venezuela on its own was never capable of triggering a world war. But Venezuela was not alone. It sat at the intersection of competing global interests, tied invisibly to larger powers that could not afford to appear weak. Russia's involvement in Venezuela was never about loyalty to Maduro. It was about precedent. If the United States could overthrow or detain a foreign leader by force without consequence, then international law became optional. Moscow feared a world where power alone determined legitimacy, because in that world, escalation becomes inevitable. Russian military doctrine is built around deterrence, not reaction. The moment the U.S. crossed a red line, Russia began drawing new ones of its own. China viewed the crisis differently, but no less seriously. Beijing's investments in Venezuela's energy sector were massive. But money was only part of the equation. China's true concern was stability. Global trade thrives on predictability, and unpredictability is the enemy of long-term power. Yet Beijing also recognized opportunity. A distracted United States, tied down by crises, creates space for influence elsewhere, in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. China did not need to fight. It only needed to wait and expand. Meanwhile, NATO faced one of its most uncomfortable moments in decades. The alliance was designed for collective defense, not unilateral offense. Some members privately questioned whether automatic support still made sense if major actions were taken without consultation. Others feared that hesitation would weaken deterrence against Russia. This internal friction mattered deeply. Alliances are strongest when trust is absolute, and trust was beginning to crack. As tensions grew, military planners around the world began mapping escalation ladders. First comes economic warfare, sanctions, asset freezes, trade disruption. Then comes cyber warfare, attacks on power grids, satellite systems, financial networks. These stages allow countries to harm each other without officially declaring war, but they also increase the risk of misinterpretation. A cyber attack that knocks out a hospital or a nuclear facility can look indistinguishable from an act of war. Nuclear fear, media warfare, and the psychology of global panic. Whenever the phrase World War III enters public conversation, one shadow immediately follows it: nuclear war, even without a single missile being launched. The fear of nuclear escalation changes behavior at every level. Governments grow secretive. Militaries shift to higher alert statuses. Civil defense plans quietly resurface. The weapons themselves remain silent, but their presence dominates every strategic calculation. In the background of the Venezuela crisis, nuclear deterrence was never spoken aloud, yet it was always there. The danger of nuclear conflict today is not rooted in intention, but in misjudgment. Unlike the Cold War, where two main rivals understood each other's red lines over decades, the modern world is multipolar. More nuclear states, more doctrines, more assumptions. A regional escalation involving non-nuclear actors can still pull nuclear powers into confrontation through alliances, misinterpreted signals, or accidental engagements. Deterrence only works when everyone understands the rules. And today, the rules are increasingly blurred. At the same time, a new battlefield has become just as powerful as missiles: information. Media warfare now shapes public perception faster than armies can move. Within hours of the Venezuela operation, contradictory narratives flooded the internet. Some framed it as liberation. Others called it invasion. Fake videos circulated. Fabricated statements were attributed to world leaders. AI-generated images blurred reality. Truth struggled to keep up with virality. In such an environment, panic spreads faster than facts. Social media amplified every fear. A single unverified post about troop movements could trigger market crashes. A misleading headline could spark protests. Algorithms rewarded outrage, not accuracy. Governments attempted to control narratives, but control itself bred suspicion. When people stop trusting official sources, they fill the void with speculation, and speculation, in times of crisis, is dangerous. Psychologically, humanity is more vulnerable than ever. The world is still carrying the weight of recent global crises: pandemics, economic instability, climate disasters. Collective stress lowers rational thinking. People expect catastrophe because catastrophe feels familiar. This emotional exhaustion creates fertile ground for extreme beliefs, conspiracy theories, and apocalyptic thinking. When fear dominates, reason retreats. Military leaders understand this well. Psychological pressure is now an intentional strategy. By increasing alert levels, conducting high-visibility exercises, or leaking selective information, states can intimidate opponents without firing a shot. But intimidation cuts both ways. The more often forces posture for conflict, the more likely someone eventually miscalculates. History is filled with moments where war began because leaders believed the other side was about to strike first. Nuclear weapons intensify this dilemma. Early warning systems are designed to react quickly, not carefully. A false alarm, a software glitch, or a misunderstood radar signal could compress decision-making into minutes. Leaders would face an impossible choice: act immediately or risk annihilation. In such moments, there is no time for diplomacy, only instinct. This is why even limited regional crises raise global alarm when nuclear powers are involved. The Venezuela situation also highlighted another modern risk: distraction warfare. While global attention focused on one crisis, other tensions quietly escalated elsewhere. Rival states tested boundaries, knowing that response capacity was stretched thin. This overlapping of crises creates strategic overload. When everything feels urgent, Nothing receives full attention, increasing the chance that something breaks. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was this. The world no longer needs a single dramatic trigger to slide into catastrophe. It needs only enough small shocks, arriving faster than systems can absorb them. Economic pressure, political polarization, digital chaos, military posturing, each alone is manageable. Together they form a pressure cooker. By the end of this phase, the fear was no longer abstract. It had entered daily life. Families discussed emergency plans. Governments updated continuity strategies. Analysts stopped asking if escalation was possible and began asking where it might happen next. The world was holding its breath, not because war had begun, but because it felt closer than it had in generations. By this stage, the world was no longer asking whether conflict was possible. The real question had shifted to something far more unsettling. Could it still be stopped? History teaches that global wars are not accidents. They are failures of restraint. They happen when fear replaces dialogue, when pride overrides reason, and when leaders believe escalation is safer than compromise. The Venezuela crisis, combined with rising global tensions, brought humanity to one of those rare crossroads where every decision mattered more than ever before. World leaders now faced three possible paths. The first was de-escalation, reopening diplomatic channels, restoring international mediation, and reinforcing global institutions weakened by years of distrust. This path required humility, patience, and political courage. It demanded leaders admit that power alone cannot create stability. Few leaders in history choose this path easily, but those who do often prevent catastrophe. The second path was managed confrontation, a dangerous middle ground, where nations continue pressuring each other through sanctions, cyber warfare, proxy conflicts, and military posturing while hoping escalation never spins out of control. This strategy has been used many times before, and sometimes it works until it doesn't. The problem with controlled tension is that it assumes humans will always act rationally under pressure. History strongly disagrees. The final path was the darkest one, uncontrolled escalation. A single miscalculation, a misunderstood signal, an accident in the air or at sea, a cyber attack that crosses an invisible red line. This is how world wars truly begin, not with speeches, but with moments that spiral faster than leaders can stop them. Once that line is crossed, control disappears and history takes over. What makes the modern era especially dangerous is not just weapons, it's speed. Decisions that once took weeks now take minutes. Information spreads instantly, whether true or false. Public pressure mounts before facts are confirmed. Leaders act not only against enemies, but under the gaze of millions demanding strength. In such an environment, restraint becomes politically risky, and risk is often mistaken for weakness. Yet despite everything, one truth remains. World War III is not inevitable. It is a choice. Every global conflict in history was preceded by warnings, moments where leaders could have stepped back but didn't. The world today is hearing those warnings again. Venezuela is not the cause. It is the signal. A reminder of how fragile global order has become and how quickly power struggles can endanger all of humanity. The question is no longer, is World War III coming? The real question is, will we stop it before history repeats itself?